when I went to Italy, in Emilia-Romagna up north, where they make Lambrusco and those kind of classic wines, there's also Modena, right? Modena. Anybody? Your cork producer probably own a Ferrari. Ferraris and balsamic vinegar. So balsamic vinegar. Anybody making balsamic vinegar in the? I know when I pour a lot of wine, the talking gets kind of going. I know. Balsamic vinegar. Anybody making some at the winery? Yeah, there you go. See, a little bit. So balsamic vinegar, the traditional one from Modena, is aged in 5 or 7 different barrels. They become smaller and smaller in size as the vinegar, evaporates over the years and sometimes decades that they age it. But the interesting thing is that it's different woods. It's not just oak. I think it's cherry and acacia and whatever else, whatever wood types you have hanging around in your area. And so I think we have underutilized the potential of other woods really in winemaking. We traditionally use oak because it makes a tight container, it makes a tight barrel that doesn't leak, and it smells nice, no doubt. But there are other interesting wood types as well, and so that's what we see more now at trade shows too, different types of woods from different, not just different forests as traditionally is done with oak, but also just different wood types. And again, that can, I think, create an interesting terroir if you do have some native species around your winery or you toast those. So try that out. That's kind of cool. Cold stabilization. Again, you see here the importance of having different layers, different levels of cooling jackets, but also the importance of having a polished inside of your tank. Normally stainless steel tanks, as we buy them, have a relatively rough surface. And rough stainless steel is microbial problem. It's not easily cleanable, even though we associate stainless steel often with cleanliness. But if you actually spend some effort and money in polishing the inside of the tank, that also makes the tartrate crystals slide down more easily. So there again, some things one can do with traditional equipment that we often don't do, but that can be helpful. Again, a huge cross-flow unit. The neat thing about cross-flow is that it's modular. You can have small things, and as you increase production or your wine is progressively cloudy, whatever varieties you're using, something high in protein like Riesling, for example, you can add more parallel units, and that allows you to finish a filtration run or finishing a bottling run if you do filter and bottle at the same time, which again can save you time without having to bypass or backwash or do any of those other things that can cause problems later on. And again, different shapes, different sizes. When you go to trade shows, it's interesting. It's often hard to ask real hard technical questions because the sales staff often, especially in Italy, it's often they hire a bunch of models. Still, even in these days, they hire models to represent their brand. It's very sad, but nonetheless, finding out actually some technical details can be challenging, even if you go to those shows. And then bottling, as I said, this is a humongous line here that I saw here. I don't know how many spouts. It had like 128 spouts or something. It's just crazy large. And that's kind of, again, when people in Italy think America, they think it's all big and everybody has huge operations and all that. And that's what's often represented at those shows. So again, having something smaller from Guy, for example, is helpful. The trade shows also are full now with distillation equipment. That's actually traditionally my specialty when I was a grad student. But that's kind of interesting to see distillation coming back. It was my first attempt for a collaboration here with Michigan, with the University of Michigan State, when there was a professor here who tried to make cherry brandy. Chris Berklund, I think was his name, chemical engineering professor back in the days. But the Kirschwasser production never has really taken off much as gin and bourbon and all does it? Are you making anybody cherry brandy here, selling it to the, no? Yeah, some people do. Fruit brandies have always been kind of a tough sell because particularly cherry brandy, Kirschwasser as they say in my old language, doesn't smell like cherries at all. And that has always been a hard sell, explaining to somebody why you would make a brandy that doesn't actually smell like the fruit. That's why pear eau de vie and those kind of things are a little bit easier to sell. There you go. The highest end Remy Martin cognac, $3,000 in the duty-free shop. So there's money to be made still in distillation, but there's also a huge bubble forming, and I'm not sure how much more $40, $80 a bottle gin one can possibly drink. When you go to those trade shows, you meet a lot of interesting folks from around the world, from around the wine industry. So again, that alone, the networking opportunity, can be quite helpful to understand different markets and all that. And you see other stuff if you go to Milan. And any of those of you who had the stale croissant for lunch here, again, if you don't appreciate stale croissants, go to Italy. It's really neat. The food alone is worth a trip. Seafood and all that kind of stuff. So that's that. So in summary, there is really no new technology other than the stuff that we already have. There will be new variations of things. Often again, it's iterations of things that we already have or have used. And a lot of the equipment that we would like to use, as I said, cross-flow or flotation, is often not available in very small models or affordable models, at least. So again, speak up as an industry to the suppliers and tell them there needs to be more stuff done on that end and not all just cater to the gallows and the constellations of the world. Let me quickly change over to the flaws then. Actually, a version of the thing. Oops. That I showed in the wine appreciation class here, and those standards are the same. So I have a former student here in the class. Just a quick overview of the major wine flaws. That's what I was asked to actually talk about here, because when new generations of winemakers come along, sometimes we forget the knowledge of the previous generation, and because there are not that many wine professors left, seeing the scientific talks is not that happening, not that frequent, and some of my colleagues, unfortunately, also, should I sell this politely, don't really know their stuff. So with that. So I brought you here those 8 samples. You smell, I'm not 100% sure if they all show as well. But for example, if you want to teach people what reduction is, or at least what hydrogen sulfide is, you can buy from chemical suppliers a little vial of sea salt sodium sulfite. And there's a little chips, and you can just take a tiny little chip and put it in a glass of wine, and it smells immediately like hydrogen sulfide, like farts, yes, sewer stuff. So again, some of the things you can make yourself. Others are a little bit harder to do, like keeping the geranium aroma going. For example, probably everybody has a standard bottle of Brett around to show the tasting room staff. But when we did the research on cork taint back in the 90s, it became very clear that consumers have a very wide range of sensitivities to TCA. We did the work back that Adam Supranant, who is a winemaker on Long Island, did it. There was at least an order of magnitude, if not 2, when you count in smokers and old people hard of smelling, not just hard of hearing, like me, my wife would say. So again, for some of us, TCA shows right away. We did some work on subthreshold TCA as well, where you have just a little bit of TCA, but it doesn't come across as that musty, moldy, traditional smell you see in the standard here, but at a level where it mutes the aroma of the wine, the fruitiness in particular. And that's a particularly characteristic of all the volatile phenolics. So what Brett produces in your wine are volatile phenolics, and again, they have a muting aroma, but and the same is true for TCA, phenol. The anisole is a substituted phenol, and the same is what we have with oak. That's why we don't put Riesling in oak barrels, typically, because the oak phenolics would be masking the terpenes in the Riesling. And the more recent problem that we have had is smoke taint. And of course, that has affected us here in the Midwest as well, as the West Coast folks are trying to unload their smoke-tainted stuff on us, right? Anybody been in that situation? Not so much, no? You trust your bulk wine suppliers, you don't buy bulk wine. Okay, just be aware if you do, have it tested, as those smoke taint components can mute the varietal characters of your wine, and they typically only show once you have the wine in the mouth. They're often, come out later in the aging process, or they again come out when you actually taste the wine. So they're hard to detect just by smelling alone or just by looking at it. But again, the group of components, be that TCA, be that Brett, smoke taint, oak aromas, all in the same chemical category and have the same muting effect. Quickly go through, actually, because I have more slides, so let me start. Here in Indiana, for example, the biggest problems are oxidation, due to the fact that I alluded to earlier, the variable tank fermenters and plastic tanks and all those things, lots of head space, lesser sophistication in the bottling operation, poor SO2 management, and those typical things that lead to oxidized wines. And oxidized wines often don't necessarily show right away. The process often affects the wines as they age, and again, that's the shelf life problem then. So if you release a wine and it looks great, great color, great aroma, but it is really bad after a year, then that means it's going to be a really hard sell if you're still sitting on some inventory. But it's also then hard to sell out of that batch of wine that's already oxidized and holding off releasing the new wine, because you want to sell out of the old vintage. But if the old vintage doesn't taste good, and it takes a long time to sell it, and you're still sitting on the new vintage that is actually at top shape, then you, again, creating a vicious circle of never having your best wine out on the market, and that eventually affects your reputation. Everybody good with sulfites? I know if you already have it in your glass. Anybody pouring those yet? Yeah, you have those. The Gewürztraminer, not unexpectedly, is quite high in SO2, and that's probably deliberately done. Those European winemakers that are shipping wine over here to the US, of course, know that even though our wines don't go typically across the equator, they get shipped to California, for example, through the Panama Canal, and bad things can happen in the Panama Canal. So again, protecting your wine to the worst case scenario that we'll see, depending on where you're selling it, that's an important part. The downside is that we often overstabilize our wine. We're adding too many chemicals, we're putting too much energy on cold stabilization, and that's not necessary. So smart winemaking should be done in a fashion that you again address your market, how fast things sell. Do they sell in the tasting room? Do you have the wine under your control in the warehouse? Is it sitting in some restaurant in godforsaken storage room? Lots of us are proud if we can sell in New York City or in Chicago or in Los Angeles. It's very prestigious to be in fancy restaurants, but the wines there are often not treated very well because they have thousands of wines to deal with, and some sell, others don't. And so again, be aware of what your wine goes through and then adjust the stabilization techniques accordingly, so you don't put too much SO2 in, too much sorbate in, don't filter too harsh, don't cold stabilize too harshly either. If you have everything on the estate, or you can tell your customers that those crystals, again, are a natural sign of the winemaking practices, part of the grapes, then there's not much need for cold stabilization. If you want to sell your wine to Costco or Walmart, where the consumers might see something funny looking on the shelf, and they'll decide, nah, we don't want that, then you lose that contract. And even though you might only make pennies per bottle, if you sell to those guys, still that would be a big contract loss. So again, I'm happy to help you, guide you through this if you have particular problems. All those off orders. I don't smell any TCA here. Are you not opening those things? Oh, you're closing it. I can't smell anything. We've got COVID or something. So they're all usually associated with particular chemicals. Some of them are more indicator components, like 4-ethylphenol, for example, is something that we use to analyze for bread. Again, a technology developed by one of my grad students, who is now a well-known winemaker. But that's not necessarily the character that you get in a bready wine, because there are a bunch of different phenolics, actually, and some of them more dominant than others in particular cases, depending on the bread strain that's in there. With TCA, it's still the good old 2,4,6-trichloroanisole, although obviously there are other components that are somewhat similar, and with smoke taint. We also have a relatively narrow range of components, although recently discovered more sulfur-containing smoke taint components, so they kind of have almost a combination between those volatile phenolics and the reduction characters, the hydrogen sulfide, the mercaptans, the skunky character, the disulfides, the onion, garlic kind of smells that you sometimes can get as well. Anybody have the Gewürztraminer? You all right then tell me, because I don't. I never get anything poured. Terrible hosts. Luckily, I brought enough of my own wine. Sorry, no, thank you again, Tony, for the invitation, and pleasure to be here. But that's good. I can pour in the same glass. No, yes. So Gewürztraminer, what is it? What's in there? It's nice Gewürztraminer, right? It's from the Alsace. Yes, no. A little bite on your tongue, all right. Now everybody is biased because you know the most in the crowd. No, it's okay. Aroma's good. What? Anything else? Geranium. Okay, interesting. Geranium, the character that occurs when lactic acid bacteria chew up the sorbate you put in on your sweet wines. Given the hundreds of thousands of wines we have seen in the wine competition over the years, or bottles rather, it's relatively rare, to be honest. But it can still happen. That's why I have the character in there. But it's the smell of the geranium leaves, not the flower. And again, it's those situations where you have not enough sulfite in your wine, thank you very much, but you already put the sorbate in, and then you have bacteria chewing up the sorbate, creating that smell that smells like geranium leaves. But good guess, although not at least not that I'm aware of.
I think the rose petal.
Rose petals, it's a little strong. You know, that's a pride and joy in Indiana. Our Traminette, you know, it's also very rich. One of the kids of Gewürztraminer and the rose petal note. But I had my assistant mix those wines together, and we're trying to do something that might be educational. Okay, so the bite of the tongue, maybe hitting into the right direction. And it is, even though it's not the geranium character, it's a particular chemical. The wine was spiked, yes? Acetic acid. The wine was spiked to the legal limit of acetic acid. What's the legal limit in white wine? Legal limit? 1.25, pretty close, 1.2. 1.2 grams per liter, which is a pretty huge amount. But I just wanted to show you that it's not as easy to detect. This is illegal to sell. But most of us as experienced winemakers here will go like, maybe a little bit, but it's a kind of a guess. It's not as obvious. It doesn't smell obviously like vinegar. Now that I told you, you're like, oh, it smells like vinegar. But to taste it. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's what that is. So sometimes, again, you need to do a chemical analysis or have somebody else do that for you to determine that your wine is actually legal to sell. Not that the people at the TTB, again, I hope this is not being recorded, but the TTB doesn't have really any experts in wine, which is sad, as the regulatory agency. They have attended some conferences, but nonetheless, you would expect a little bit more on that end. So your chances of getting audited or dinged for having too much VA in your wine is probably pretty small. And initially, those limits were set so that the growers wouldn't ship, half rotten grapes to the big wineries. But again, this is just an example of one flaw that sometimes it's hard to detect it directly just by smelling, even if you're experienced. Yet some off orders, they might be regulated, like VA here in the US. Or it can be other things that maybe exports markets will mind if you're trying to sell those to them. So anyway, so again, you can do those things easily. This is just regular Heinz vinegar that was added here. 1,200 milligrams per liter, so 1.2 grams for whites, 1.4 for reds, a little bit higher, but that's, I think, the old rules. They'll do the red wine next. I don't know. I don't want to bore you with a lot of chemical formulas. Especially you can't see them, but sulfur obviously is one of the most important molecules or elements rather in wine, because it comes in all those different forms and shapes. The oxidized version, the sulfur dioxide, the sulfate that can form in wines, in old wines, for example, where both the total and the free SO2 drop, those situations. Sulfide, again here on the laser pointer. Oh, you see that, the laser pointer. Over here, sulfide always plays a role in the vineyard, although not so much here, as we don't usually treat for a lot of powdery mildew, but it's happening too. But if you use elemental sulfur against mildew in the vineyard, what happens to that sulfur? Some of it, if you spray too close to harvest, might make it in small, little yellow specks. If the cluster grows shut, it makes it into your winery. But during the season or after you spray, some of it will kind of oxidize, will evaporate as SO2. Some will actually form white coat on your grapes, and it's sulfate. And then what happens to the sulfate? Well, sulfate, when it rains, as it does occasionally in the Midwest, will wash into the ground, right? And then what's in the ground? The roots, right? And so then the roots might take up the sulfate. And that's why you often get problems with hydrogen sulfide. Because if we have a lot of sulfate in our juice, which we normally don't analyze for, or can't analyze for, if you have a lot of sulfate in your juice, then you will actually get the yeast as we do a fermentation. French speakers, ferment, enclosed, closed. It's a reductive environment. So if we have a yeast that reduces the sulfates to hydrogen sulfide, here on the other end, oxidized version, yeast reducing to hydrogen sulfide, then you get the stinky stuff, the rotten egg and so on character. So that's how that is related. But we usually don't assess those chemicals in our musts and juices because there are no easy and robust methods to do so. And as I said, you have elemental sulfur you spray in the vineyard. You have sulfide, that's the one with a D here now, the rotten egg character, and then you have the sulfides, the ones where two of those molecules react, and those are the ones that are much harder to take care of. So traditionally, we can, if everything goes wrong, we can treat hydrogen sulfide mercaptans with copper, right? Copper fining is the way to do this. So adding a heavy metal to your wine, great solution. And there's a legal limit for copper here in the US, which ridiculously enough is much higher than the international limit for copper. So we can do things here that would be prohibited to be sold in our export markets. So your neighbors up in the Letterkenny area, they're our biggest export market because we buy their bloody ice wine and we comply with their bloody ice wine rules in return. But again, if you are looking at sending your wines elsewhere, be aware that some of our rules again are made by an agency that doesn't know anything about wine, and that can become a problem. So copper against hydrogen sulfide against mercaptans or thiols, and then the disulfides are the ones that are a little bit of the bigger problem. The smells here, as we already talked about, the cabbage and corn, cooked corn and onions and all those characters. Again, in small concentrations, they can be desirable. There's some famous winemakers, Steve Kissler, Chardonnay legend out in California. They made wines that deliberately slightly reduce those little nutty characters. I'm not saying that all gentlemen like to smell their own farts, but there's a certain allure to those reduced characters, right? It's kind of, the stinkiness sometimes can be in small doses kind of interesting. But in most cases, we want to get rid of them because they, again, overpower the varietal character of the wine. And again, that's done traditionally with copper. Some 40 years ago, we actually had a chemical that we could use to pull excess copper back out of the wine. And there's some new techniques now, some filter pads and things that allow you, I'm not sure if anybody from Scott is still here, to pull excess copper back out of the wine because copper not only binds those stinky components, but it can also cause hazes. It can catalyze oxidative reactions. So it's not good to throw a lot of copper into your wine. And again, the intelligent winemaker avoids the production of those chemicals altogether. How do you do this? By knowing, for example, the nutrient composition of your juice or must. As I said earlier, that's relevant for a lot of different issues, stuck fermentations, as well as hydrogen sulfide production. So sometimes I ask people, what do you do if your wines or if your fermentation is getting stinky? And then people go, I'm going to throw some DAP in. Well, where the hell is that knowledge coming from? And that goes back to some of the things that were taught for many years and incorrectly taught at different academies, in different seminars. And so again, sometimes we have to revisit those old lectures and come up with better solutions that are actually working. On the other hand, we're limited by the amount of analysis that we can do. Particularly if you're small wineries, you can analyze for heavy metals, you can analyze for vitamins, you can analyze for amino acids. But in all reality, we don't have the time or the resources to do that. And so that's why we often overcompensate by heavy fining, by heavy nutritional additions, by things that we could avoid if we actually had better ways and easier ways to analyze things. So that's where I think the universities can come in to develop some better, quicker, more robust, easier, cheaper methods to analyze some of the things that avoid off odors or other fermentation problems in the future. But as programs are getting cut and people retire, that will probably not happen. The mercaptans, skunk cabbage, burnt rubber, again, they develop mainly produced by yeast too. We have some yeasts now that are not genetically engineered, but that are able not to produce those stinky components. But again, they're just a few strains. By the way, I have a colleague, and we're working together on a project. Maybe that's the future, even though it's scary, to genetically engineer yeasts and embed plant genes inside the yeast. So in the future, we'll have yeast that can produce anthocyanins, yeast that can produce tannins, yeast can produce terpenes, and all those things. So in the future, we might be able to make Riesling without grapes. Everybody getting excited here? No, we're not quite there yet, but it is a consideration, considering that it takes 80 to 100 bottles of water to make every bottle of wine. So out in California, that's a big problem. And so if we in the future can do something, maybe to have the yeast produce more acids, produce more color pigments, other things, I don't think that would be a bad thing to have. Although the French-Italian winemakers will rotate in their graves when I talk about this, but it's fun to watch. I don't know, we're making slow progress here, but we still have a few minutes. Hydrogen sulfide mercaptans, those are very, very potent components. Not quite as TCA, so that's another few orders of magnitude stronger than those sulfur components, but they do carry a lot. As you know, when you smell a skunk, that had been killed a mile away down the road, and those carry for quite a bit. The disulfides, on the other hand, the more oniony smells, they don't smell as strongly. So 30 micrograms versus 1 microgram. Why is that relevant? Because these two can turn into this thing here. And that can happen particularly if you expose any stinky wines to air, to oxygen, if you aerate your tank, which to some degree gets rid of the very volatile hydrogen sulfide, but it can also lead to the oxidation of the mercaptans. They form disulfides. You think they're gone because, again, the sensory threshold is so much higher. So you think you aerate the tank, everything is fine and dandy, it doesn't smell anymore. Turns out you actually oxidize the mercaptans to disulfides, and once the wine is in the bottle, and again, ferment, it's a closed environment, particularly if you have a screw cap on, you'll get those things to split back up, and you have the mercaptans again, and your wine is stinky. That's for a while that the Australian winemakers put a little bit of copper into their wines under screw cap at bottling. Turns out they don't do that anymore because, again, as I said earlier, the copper creates all kinds of other reactions. It catalyzes all kinds of oxidative reactions, browning reactions, hazes, and all kinds of stuff. So it's not a good idea to just routinely dose copper into that. But it has always been a bit of an issue with screw caps to have this really completely reduced environment. So that's why, again, why it's important that the winemaker has to make sure that the wine doesn't have any of those components in it before it goes into the bottle and is closed, and not after. I don't know. Do you have stinky wines? When I was in California, that was the biggest of all the problems, were stinky wines. That and stuck fermentations. Don't really see a lot of stinky Rieslings. Do you any have Pinot Noir? Okay. What about Brettanomyces? Anybody ever seen Brettanomyces in white wines? Not so often. Can happen. Can happen too. All right, Pinot Noir here. Since you mentioned it, thank you, keeping me on track here. As you can tell, I'm improvising all this. All right. This is not Central Otago, but Marlborough Pinot from the South Island of New Zealand. Quite nice. Anybody been to New Zealand? There we go. All right, yeah. That's a neat place to visit. There's hardly anybody living there. So, are you from New Zealand? I don't want. No, I live around. Yeah, it's really, but big country and lots of places to go when it gets warmer, and the Pinots are certainly attractive. What's going on here? Any guess? It's hard to be under pressure, huh? It's easy for me to say because I know what was put in there. Yes?
A little bready.
Little bready, you would say? Okay.
Smoky when I first saw it.
Smoky bready, okay. Some of the things we talked about, those what did you say?
Nail polish?
Nail polish, all right. That was just an accident this morning. I put some on. I just apologize for that. All right, not to drag this out too much, I'll show you what this is. It's hard to get standards there. I know there's some researchers doing it, but just in case, if you come across, where did it go? I don't know what's in here. There we go. And those components, as I said, there's a set of them. But anybody using this at home? It's liquid smoke. You know, the stuff you can buy at the grocery store here. Hickory. Good stuff. So again, it's not the pure smoke taint that you would see out in California or in Washington or in Oregon now, but it's a little bit goes into that direction. Again, the range of chemicals are what is also here in the liquid smoke. In my experience, the smoke taint is a little bit more like if your neighbor burns trash in a barrel. That kind of smell, it's like all kinds of funky stuff that he has in there, and can be a little plasticky or dead body or whatever they burn there. So it's not like a campfire, you know, like a nice smell or toasted oak barrel or things like that. So, so there's a little bit, just again a touch, almost sub-recognition threshold. So you just a little bit in it. I'm sorry, I should have brought another 6 bottle of the Pinot for comparison. But again, you can do those things easily at home if you want to try that. But again, it shows you that even very small amounts of a spike like this are not as easy to recognize. Yet this wine actually, that we don't have the pure version, I apologize to the winemaker here, smells a lot more fruity, smells a lot different than what you actually have in the glass right now. So that really tiny amount of liquid smoke, even though it's not offensive necessarily at all, certainly has a big difference and certainly makes the wine completely different from what the winemaker intended. Yeah, so that's what that is. If you want to put a heavier dose in, I brought the whole bottle here. It's $1.69 or something like that. So it goes a long way. But again, be aware if you buy wine from the West Coast that if the offer is too good to be true, that it's worth having those chemicals checked. So you can have those checked by some of the labs like ETS and so on, and that way you get a clean bill of health if you bottle that wine for your local clients. If you like it, on the other hand, and then that's your style. That's great too. So now come the wines from the. Who brought wine? And who else? All right. It's going to get interesting now. So that was my initial intention. When Maddie invited me, they said, oh, it's going to be like a small group of winemakers. We sit around the table drinking wine. And then I come here, and it's like PowerPoint and 100 people. But nonetheless, that's also very nice and much fun. But again, tasting all together, it's a little awkward too, And I appreciate those people actually speaking up, even if they were wrong, because I realize speaking up in a large audience is not for everybody. I'm an introvert, as you might guess, and so speaking up in front of large audience took a lot of training, 30 years or so. So. Don't give up on that, but always voice your opinion. If you detect something, that's the beauty in our industry. Whatever you say, 50% will agree with you, 50% will not. So that's just the way it is with any wine. Oh God, I got something. Yeah, come. Cheers. Cheers. Yeah. So I had asked to bring something that's not necessarily problematic, but something maybe interesting, something. A little bit funky. I think we have too many clean wines, and I think Riesling is one of those varieties that is often made too clean, too perfect, and so people like me, like us, we have seen a lot of wine. So for us to be impressed or intrigued by something takes a little bit extra effort, What's that, mint melon? Yes. All right. By the way, all those slides here, I'm not going to get through all of them, but I'll be able to see those later some way or the other on the MSU website here. As I said before, I was not allowed to mention or dress in a University of Michigan outfit, and I'm glad to report that both the MSU's and Purdue's football teams, is it suck or blow? Both. But I toast to the day when university professors get paid as much as football coaches, even if they're not successful. So let me ask you this, almost everybody. Why did you bring this? What is a tank sample?
This is a tank sample.
Okay. Sorry.
So as an organizer of the event, I asked around to a few people last minute if they had anything funky and tried not to offend anyone. And so someone told me that they had a funky wine, but they were not able to make it. So this white wine is said funky wine. So his tanks were full, and his press was full and sat full in the press for a while. It fermented out after it got pressed, I think after about a week. And with his tanks full, he just said, we'll just see what happens. So this is the result of seeing what happens.
Not one of the biggest skills, but figuring out how much tank space you need and how much fruit is coming in.
His one request was to ask the audience if they had an idea of what grape it was.
Again, you can do in this situation, you can do the old copper penny trick. All our pennies do have copper on the outside, and even though I don't know who touched your penny or how long it was in your pocket, that's still the best way of having a little bit of copper to get rid of the initial stinkiness in the wine here. So again, there is some reduction in here, and given the way it smelled, it could still be fixed a little bit. But there's also seems to be a little bit, and again, that's just my opinion, a little bit of high VA going on in there. So that's pretty cool. You're truly, having all kinds of different things going on there. There's a niche market for everything. You can sell belly button lint on eBay, but probably something with funky wines. But I don't know. And so little celery kind of note. Again, the kind of the disulfide notes in there as well. I wouldn't make a guess on the variety there. Anybody see anything else? I don't want to bias anybody. Riesling over there. Okay, all right. Riesling. Anything else that I'm missing? Is there geranium or nail polish or Brett or something nail polish? Little nail polish. So I haven't gotten to this, but that combination of VA. And you see the threshold limits again. That's typically produced by yeast during the fermentation, and kind of a little bit at the same time, depending on how high the sugar concentrations were at harvest. The nail polish character is ethyl acetate here, so the reaction product between vinegar, between acetic acid and alcohol, ethanol. And so that's the ester that forms, and that particularly forms if, again, both of them are high. It's actually quite difficult to create it just because you put some alcohol, let's say you put some vodka and some vinegar together, that does not quickly give you nail polish character. So if you want to spike a wine, actually get yourself some ethyl acetate-based nail polish remover, or it's typically also the solvent for nail polish, although it's kind of more difficult to pour nail polish into a glass of wine, but don't use the, what's the other nail polish remover component? Acetone. So that's a whole different smell. That can be produced too by bacteria, but that's what we usually don't have. This is something that's often caused by yeast stress. So if you have lots of alcohol, and again, it's a matter of having high both the yeast being stress producing acetic acid as well as high sugars producing high alcohol. The important thing about the nail polish character versus the acetic acid character, it cannot be removed. So there's no fining agent to take it back out. Acetic acid, you can actually use reverse osmosis, and it has been widely used in California for many years to reduce, again, the VA level below the legal limit. But once this has formed or is present in your wine, you're kind of stuck with it. To some degree, that's true for bread too. And that's the slide here I want to get to. Again, it's those components that can be both good, bad, ugly, whatever you personally like or what your audience likes. All those molecules here can, at least in theory, be removed by different filtration techniques, be that molecular filtration like reverse osmosis or some other techniques. But because they're all in the same kind of size category and chemical category, if you have a smoke-tainted wine and you put that into your brand new, whatever, $1,500 French oak barrel, and you then filter it, you're taking out all that money you just spent on the oak to get rid of bread or to get rid of smoke taint and those components. So that's why it's important to test things before you put them in so that doesn't happen. I don't know. What else? 20 minutes I have left. As I said, we have a lot of stuff. Oh, that's just skipping through here. Sorry about this. But one important thing I brought back home from Australia the other year was that Brettanomyces has evolved. As I said, we often have it growing here in our barrels because we can't put a lot of SO2 in if the wines haven't undergone malolactic, because they're too acidic in a northern climate. And so the traditional approach to SO2 dosing has been 0.85 molecular, right? We're shooting with our SO2 additions at bottling for 0.85 molecular. During the 1990s, there were some wineries in California who said, to hell with the knowledge of science, let's do the threshold at 0.6. Let's put in less SO2 because SO2 is nasty and smells and it's difficult to handle. Let's finish our reds in 0.6 and also don't filter them anymore because filtration is bad. So that led to a whole range of wines that had a lot of bread and other issues. And so then the winemakers compensated for that. And so for many years we have used 0.85 molecular as the guideline to the calculations, the recommendations you do of what SO2 levels you have to have at bottling. The old rule of thumb is you take the pH of the wine, and of course SO2 addition corresponds to your wine's pH, that you take the number behind the point, and
You ready with this?
I think I'll make some more comments, that you take that number. So if your pH of your wine is 3.5, then it is 50, the number behind the point, 50 milligrams per liter of free SO2 that you need to protect that wine. Now, and so if you go up to a pH of 4, if you have to have something really, really flabby, you have to put 100 free in. If you have a sparkling wine at 3.1, you only need 10 parts free SO2 to get to the 0.85 molecular. Now, again, it turns out over the years of winemaking, at least in Australia, and I would assume that's true for the rest of the world, the bread strains that we have around our wineries have become more resistant, much like those antibiotic-resistant bacteria strains that almost killed me a few years ago. So now they have found some bread strains that are resistant against 1.25 molecular. So that's almost 50% more SO2 that's required to manage that bread than what you would normally add. So instead of, let's say, you're bottling your wine at 50 free, now you should really bottle it at 75 free. And if you have something, as I said, a little bit more flabby, lower in acid, higher in acid, lower in pH, then you suddenly get to levels of SO2 that you need to protect this wine microbially that you can actually obviously smell. And that has always been the problem. In the past, that was mainly a problem for sorbate. Sorbate for sweet wines, we need to add at a concentration that's very much at the level of where we can taste it. But now the same is becoming true for SO2. And of course, we don't have any alternatives. Yes, you can still filter your wine, but then it's harder to sleep at night. And we don't have any alternative really to SO2 because it does multiple things for our wines. It has so for the last 2,000 years. So that's certainly something to watch. So if you do have problems, and I experienced myself, particularly in combination with those high nutrient levels in hybrid varieties that I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of kind of yeast that can grow quite strongly and produce a really funky notes in wine, to a point where I observed it myself, where there was kind of a house strain at the winery that regrew every year in the tanks, in the stainless steel tanks, clean tanks, where the character of the wines were so kind of beloved, people recognized the wine for that character. And when I cleaned it up, the wine was a lot more fruity, but tasted completely different. Because again, for many years, because of the nutrient levels of that particular variety and the resident yeast in the winery, you had a reproducible funkiness to that wine that really had nothing to do with the actual varietal character. So again, you just have to be aware that the environment is changing. As I mentioned earlier, cellar temperatures are changing, so bread likes it warm. So again, that's all a little disconcerting. Anything else here? I have a bunch of extension publications. I have the Purdue Winemaking certificate. So if you want to listen to this here, not just for 2 hours, but for 40 or 60 hours, be my guest. You can do that too. Geranium, as I said, we don't see that very often, which is kind of a surprise. But nonetheless, whenever you do have a geranium or pelargonium, really, if you are a horticulturist at home, you're smelling those. Again, it's just like cork tin, I said earlier, it's one of those characters that's not really offensive. It's a flower, it's kind of pretty, but again, it completely overwhelms all the other characters in a wine, and that's what we don't.